Hello, dear students. Myself, Mohammad Iqbal. Hope you are doing well. Today, we are going to discuss about a new chapter, and that is the living world. The living world. The living world. How to describe the living entities in the living world? We are going to enter in the fascinating world of living entity. How to describe? There is a criteria to describe this living world. There are some important properties to discuss about the living world. That is, the criteria behind this is growth. These are the important properties on the basis of which we can discuss about the living from the non-living entities: growth, reproduction, then consciousness. These are the important properties. So before we are going to discuss about these properties, we must know, and there is one more property, that is metabolism. So before we will discuss these properties, we must know there are some important terminologies regarding this chapter. That is, these are the characteristic properties, and next is defining properties. What is the characteristic property? Characteristic property of living organisms and defining properties of the living organisms. We'll discuss them one by one. Characteristic property and defining property. Defining property is that property which is exclusively present in all living organisms. That means there is no exception of these defining properties. They are exclusively present in all the living organisms. But characteristic properties are those properties which have some exceptions. Let us discuss them by the examples. Suppose if I talk about the characteristic property, these characteristic properties are present in, suppose if I talk about the infertile couples, is the example. Infertile couples are also living organisms, but they cannot reproduce. They cannot reproduce. That means the property of reproduction is absent in the infertile couples. That is why this is the characteristic property. This is the exception. This cannot be called as the defining property. So, or another example is working bees. Working bees. So, defining, if we talk about these four, growth and reproduction, these two properties are the defining, these two properties are the characteristic properties. That means these two properties can be, there are some exceptions, they can be present in non-living organisms or non-living entities as well. But if we talk about these two, consciousness and metabolism, they are defining property. That means there is no exception. They are exclusively present in all the living organisms. They cannot be found in the non-living entities. And hope you guys got this definitions of characteristic property and the defining properties. So let us discuss these properties like growth, reproduction, consciousness, and metabolism one by one. What is growth? Growth is irreversible, permanent change in the mass and number of living cells, of living organisms. What is growth? Growth is irreversible permanent change. What is irreversible permanent change? Means growth cannot be reversed in case of living organisms. Suppose if we talk about the plants, and there are some exceptions, plants and humans. Human growth is restricted. At some age, humans cannot grow further. But so far as the plants, and this is unlimited. There is unlimited growth. Because they have some special cells like meristematic cells. They keep on dividing, and plants keep on growing. They show profusely branching. There is a secondary growth in case of plants, but in case of humans, their growth is restricted to some age. We know that after the teen age we cannot grow further. There is a restricted height, there is a restricted, but in case of weight it can be increased. So that is why it's called as irreversible permanent change in the mass and number of living cells of living organisms. I have given you the example of plants and animals, that plants show unlimited growth, whereas humans show restricted growth. So now increase in mass and number of cells, or the twin characteristics of growth. Suppose if I talk these about the growth, this is an increase in the mass and number of cells, or the twin characteristics of growth, but they are not defining property, they are characteristics of growth. We know growth in living organisms is intrinsic. Growth can be seen in living organisms as well as non-living organisms, but in case of living organisms growth is intrinsic, but in case of non-living organisms growth is extrinsic. Suppose if I talk about the living organisms, they show intrinsic growth, and if I talk about the non-living organisms, they show extrinsic. Suppose increase in the mass of when there is accumulation of soil in the forests, that is a growth, but that is extrinsic. And if we talk about the intrinsic growth is shown by the living organisms.